Hello, everyone, and welcome to ADAA's new public webinar, Climate Anxiety, What We Know So Far, featuring Dr. Susan Clayton. Dr. Clayton is a Whitmore Williams Professor of Psychology at the College of Wooster in Ohio. Her research examines people's relationships with the natural environment, and she has written about the effects of climate change on mental health and about climate anxiety in particular. She is a lead author on the forthcoming 6th assessment report of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'd like to take a brief moment to touch upon ADAA. ADAA works to prevent, treat, and cure anxiety disorders and depression through the alignment of science, treatment, and education. Our website is full of free resources, including our Find a Therapist platform, our free online support group, and much, much more. Visit adaa.org to learn more. Dr. Clayton, please take it away.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak about this topic today. I want to talk about the idea of climate anxiety, and it's really a topic that people are only just beginning to address in detail. So that's why I've said what we know so far, we're really just beginning, but we know a lot already. So I think the foundation for talking about climate anxiety is, and not to tell you anything that you don't know already, but to recognize that climate change threatens human health. And some of the ways in which it does that, we've seen certainly many of us have personally experienced or seen up at close range recently, storms, wildfires, floods, drought, not quite as dramatic, but also still clearly affects human well-being. It's important to recognize the impacts of slower gradual changes like rising temperatures and rising sea levels. There's not an acute onset of these events, but nevertheless, they will have an effect on us. And due to the things I've already mentioned, there'll be a significant amount of displacement. Humans will have to, in some cases, leave their homes. Their homes may vanish completely, or they just may no longer be suitable to live in. One of the effects that people consider to be a serious problem associated with climate change is actually food insecurity. So impacts on agriculture and on the nutritional value of food are going to lead to increases in food insecurity. And a lot of us have been thinking about the spread of disease. And while it's not easy to link COVID closely to climate change, it's definitely the case that climate change does increase the spread of diseases by, for example, increasing the range of insects or animals that may carry a particular disease. So with all these negative effects, sorry, that wasn't supposed to happen that quickly. With all those negative effects, not only is our physical health affected, and I think people are beginning to recognize that, but also our mental health and even societal well-being. And I want to particularly highlight the idea that inequity is one of the ways, increases in inequity are one of the ways in which society will be affected. Societies in which there are high levels of inequity tend to be societies in which people are less happy. There's more stresses to mental health when you're living with high levels of inequity. And we know that climate change is already affecting different groups of people very differently and will certainly continue to do so. So one somewhat positive note is that awareness of the problem of climate change is definitely on the increase. There were some years when awareness kind of went up and down, but now it seems to be definitively going up. And these are data from less than a year ago collected by the Pew Research Center. Japan is separated out because nobody really knows what was going on with Japan there, but all these other countries are showing significant increases in concern about climate change. And I see that the US is not in here, but concern is also going up in the United States. And along with this concern, anxiety is also growing. And this is presumably why you're here today. We know by doing a Google search that people are talking more about climate anxiety and eco-anxiety. People are reporting more experiences of it. So there's definitely increases there. And to think about the impact of that, I want to sort of raise the question, well, what is anxiety exactly? Anxiety isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, we probably developed the ability to feel anxious because it has an adaptive function. Anxiety is an emotional response to a potential problem. It's like a traffic sign or a warning light. It says, hey, pay attention, there's something here you need to be thinking about. However, as probably all of you can empathize with, sometimes anxiety becomes so strong that it becomes dysfunctional. People's state of emotional arousal essentially inhibits them from an ability to process the information and address the anxiety. And so they may engage in sort of repetitive thoughts, kind of like wheels spinning as they're thinking about the topic. So a few years ago, I was thinking a lot about mental health impacts of climate change, and a lot of people were asking me about eco-anxiety or climate anxiety and whether it was a threat to mental health. And I realized we didn't really know. Again, the question is, was it at that adaptive level or was it at that dysfunctional level? So with my colleague, Brian Carazia, we developed a measure to assess levels of climate anxiety. And we based this on existing measures of mental health or mental illness rather. So we really wanted to see, is climate anxiety interfering with people's ability to function at some level? And so we included a number of items and we did the appropriate statistical tests to make sure that it was a sort of coherent and valid measure. And we discovered two components, although they were related to each other. One emphasized sort of thoughts and emotions. So thinking about climate change makes it difficult for me to concentrate, or maybe I find myself crying because of climate change. And the other strand emphasized behaviors. My concerns about climate change interfere with my ability to have fun, or my ability to sleep, or my ability to work. So again, these are closely related to each other, but they did seem to be somewhat distinguishable. And they were both connected to people's experience or people's reports that they had personally experienced climate change in some way. They were also related to established measures of anxiety and depression. So that essentially told us that, yes, for some people, climate anxiety is powerful enough that it is threatening mental health. So this, we only developed this measure or only published this measure about 1.5 years ago, but there has already been a significant amount of research, and some of what we found already, I show you here studies that have looked at a variety of different countries, so you can get a sense that it's not just in the US. But yes, in the United States, among college students, climate anxiety was associated with general anxiety and depression. Only the behavioral subscale was associated with depression, major depressive disorder. In Canada, this is a very interesting study. It was fortuitous that they happened to measure climate anxiety before the heat dome that you may remember from last summer. And then they were able to assess it again after the heat dome. And levels of climate anxiety were significantly higher after that heat dome event. In the Philippines, which is very strongly threatened with climate change, people showed, again, significant relationship between climate anxiety and impaired mental health. This has also been found in German adults. And this last study did not use the climate anxiety measure. It just asked people about their mental health, but I include it because it included a very large sample. And they did find that people who were reporting negative emotions about climate change were also reporting insomnia and threats to their own mental health. So we do know some things. And just to put that in different terms here, just some quotes. And these are quotes from young climate activists who I've been listening to over the past few months. Just made note of some of the things they've said. One talked about a physical manifestation of feeling stressed and panicked. One young man said he felt depressed and disempowered and he stopped eating properly. And one just described the Council of Parties that was recently held in Glasgow as traumatic. So you are seeing these kind of illustrations of climate anxiety, especially among young people. And we are seeing that younger adults are showing higher levels of climate anxiety. And this study in particular that I was involved in was done just last spring. Again, it's a different large sample, but another very large sample that we chose 10 countries around the world. We tried to pick a variety of very different places, some of which were already powerfully affected by climate change, some of which not so much. And 1,000 people were sampled in each country. And the countries are illustrated on the map if you're interested. And we found that 8 out of these were age 60 to 25. So some who nominally still counted as children, some who you would call young people. 8 out of 10 said they worried about climate change threatening people on the planet. And 45% said yes, it was affecting their daily functioning. So I was, to be honest, quite surprised about the findings were so dramatic. Among such a broad sample. I think we're seeing that climate anxiety is a real phenomenon. It's not just privileged elite who have the maybe time on their hands to worry about it. It's people who are already being affected by it in a very direct way. So I wanted to say a little bit about resilience. I don't just want to talk about how people are feeling anxious. I mean, we're all, maybe not all of us, but many of us are feeling anxious. We know that anxiety levels have been going up during the pandemic. So how can we become resilient in the face of these many sources of anxiety that we're facing? And when we think about the idea of resilience, I want to say that this is not just kind of coping at an emotional level, but it's adapting because we are facing new conditions. We're not going to go back to the world as it was before climate change, because the impact on the environment is irreversible within a time frame that is meaningful to us. That doesn't mean it can't be reduced, it can't be mitigated, but it cannot be stopped or reversed. So we need to think about adaptation. And I think we also need to think about not just individual resilience, but also community resilience. So psychologists have traditionally focused on individual mental health, but certainly there are a lot of people, and not just psychologists, who think about health within the community context. And we know that's very important to well-being as well. So if we look about individual mental health, say taking an individual who's coping with severe anxiety about the climate and climate change, and I do see reports of this, see many reports of this, and I know there are many individuals like this out there. So a traditional approach should be to encourage them to find ways to manage their anxiety. For example, focus on how to cope with these problematic levels of emotion. Maybe think about cognitive reframing, which is a typical technique that might be used for anxiety. So how can you frame the problem in a different way that makes it seem not quite so catastrophic? Encouraging people to detach, so walk away from the problem. When it comes to climate change, I would say maybe step away from the news, give yourself a break from social media. De-stress, practice perhaps mindful breathing or other mindfulness kinds of techniques, again, that will just reduce those levels of anxiety and arousal. And those can be really useful, especially if somebody's climate anxiety seems overwhelming. But focusing on individual mental health does not address the problem of climate change. We want to think not just about that sort of short-term dealing with the emotions and the arousal, but also a long-term response. And here, what might make both individual, well, I'll focus on individuals for a minute. What might make individuals more resilient is a focus on building up their strengths. So some things that are particularly important to coping with anxiety in the face of climate change would be some abilities at self-regulation, regulation of emotions, regulation of behavior, delay of gratification, and so on. But also a feeling of connection. Now, for many people, this is actually a connection to the natural world, which can be really beneficial to your mental health. But social connection, we know, is very important and very strongly associated with health and well-being. And then a perception of efficacy, which may be hard to come about when it comes to climate change, but a sense that what you do will have an impact. This essentially might encourage people to focus on the problem, which is traditionally the other type of coping we talk about, emotion-focused or problem-focused. The trouble with problem-focused coping, though, is that when it comes to climate change, there's not likely to be, again, at least in the short term, a complete solution where we could say, okay, did that, fix that problem, now I can move on. So a problem-focused coping might actually lead to the maintenance of those negative emotions and anxiety associated with climate change. And here's a study that I ran across that I wanted to share with you, was presented at a conference based on university students in the United Kingdom. And they were asked about climate anxiety. And one of the questions they were asked is, what methods do you use to cope with your worries? And here were some of the things they mentioned: personal action, activism, talking to others, exercise, spending time in nature, distraction, staying informed, and mindfulness. So you see a lot of these things are things that I've kind of just gone over at some level: the taking action, talking to people to stay connected, de-stressing maybe through exercise and spending time in nature, detaching through distraction. And some people have said, and this is a direct quote from another young climate activist, the best cure for anxiety is activism. So I want to say two things about that. One is there's some evidence for that, or at least maybe not the best cure, but a cure. So why would that be? Well, activism, most importantly, I think gives you that sense of efficacy and gives you a feeling of control. Even if you can't control the problem, you are controlling your own behavior. You're not just passively being kind of buffeted about by climate change, but you are an active agent. So there's that increased sense of activism. There's that increased sense of efficacy. Activism also typically serves to connect you with other people. And definitely climate activists say this over and over, the positive emotions and positive experiences associated with working together with other people. So that really enhances that connection. So I do think that taking action can be extremely useful in helping to cope with climate anxiety. But I also want to mention caveats, why this might have some drawbacks or may not always be the best approach. This is from the same study of UK university students. And they were asked, does activism make your worry better? Does it make your worry worse? And they said both. It says it makes their worries better because it gives them that sense of agency. It overcomes their feelings of powerlessness, and there's solidarity and group action. So essentially what I was just saying. But also it can make them feel that they're never doing enough. And a lot of activists can sometimes feel the weight of the world on their shoulders, that everything they do has to be correct. It's never okay to drive their car. It's never okay to fly somewhere. It's never okay to eat meat. And that's a crushing burden for any individual, especially a young activist. So in that case, it can definitely increase anxiety. And of course, activism it makes it harder to detach. You're more aware of the scale of the problem. You're always thinking about it. So you're not giving yourself those little breaks. So I do want to emphasize that although I think action, which isn't the same as activism, it can include activism, but there are other kinds of action as well. Action is a very useful way to cope with climate anxiety, but there are sort of limits that we should bear in mind. And in addition to emotion-focused coping and problem-focused coping, Swedish psychologist Maria Ayala whose name I'm probably pronouncing wrong, talked about a third type of coping, which is meaning-focused coping. And she was specifically talking about how people come to terms with climate change. And finding meaning can come from a variety of domains, but here are three important ones. One is very importantly a sense of hope. And hope is not the same as optimism, but hope is a sense that we're not doomed, that positive outcomes are possible. And of course, that's fundamental for protecting our emotions. It's also fundamental for taking action. You have to believe that positive change is possible. But also that sense of purpose. People really want to feel that their lives have meaning. And climate change action is certainly not the only way to find that sense of purpose, but it is one way. And I think that, in fact, many people report very positive emotions and feelings of validation because they feel that their work on climate change matters, it makes a difference. And finally, we can find meaning through working with others and learning to trust others. And I think perhaps many of us are increasingly struggling with high levels of distrust and mistrust in society, but we can still hopefully at least identify groups of people that we trust, and watching other people who are trying to do the right thing is such a powerful source of optimism for me, a way to regain my trust in other people. And that really does help me to feel more positive, essentially have a more positive worldview. So I'll just close by saying, I think climate change we have to think about it not just as a problem, although it is a problem, not just a threat to our mental health, but an opportunity to improve our mental health. I think one thing we've seen over the past couple of years is an increased awareness within society of threats to mental health, and of the fact that people's mental health can be threatened by circumstances and not just by their own internal or personal problems. So recognizing that can hopefully lead us to develop ways to more proactively support mental health, not just among individuals, but in the community at large. And this is a quote from The Lancet, which is a very well-respected journal of reports on health issues. Countries should undergo a shift from understanding climate change solely as a threat to recognizing that the response to climate change is an opportunity to enhance human health and well-being. And thank you for your attention.